Thank you. And now it's time for our second panel for today. Unequal by Law, How Religion Usurps Citizenship Rights in Egypt, moderated by Raymond Ibrahim, author, public speaker, and Middle East and Islam specialist.
Sure, I have to adjust it too. All right, good afternoon, everyone. As indicated, I think in many ways what we're going to be discussing in this panel, based on the title, really gets to the heart of the issue because it deals with the concept of citizenship or lack thereof in this context. We have two great panelists who I will be giving most of the time to discuss this issue, but I'd like to begin by a sort of historical backdrop, which you might have already heard. Adel Gindi and others have mentioned it, and the fact that there's some redundancy underscores the importance of it because it's actually the heart of what we're talking about. So Islam enters, or the Arab conquest enters or conquers Egypt right around 641 AD. And then after that, of course, you have the general persecution, destruction of churches, et cetera, the same sort of thing that happened all throughout the Mideast. And then we come to the important documents. You've heard of Ahd Omar, or the conditions, or better yet, the stipulations of Omar, named after either the first or second Omar. There's some debate about that, Caliph. And you heard some of the text of what the stipulations are. So no, you can't build churches, you can't fix churches. Churches are supposed to be left to crumble and die, essentially. And one of the stipulations a few people are familiar with, but I think might resonate very well with a modern American audience, because it has some parallels with the whole civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, buses, and whatnot. Is it actually says in the conditions of Omar that a Christian or a Jew, a dhimmi, has to actually give up their seat if a Muslim wants it. Okay, so I think in many ways that captures the essence of the relationship between the Muslim and the conquered population, who we cannot call, obviously, citizens, certainly not by any modern standards. They are basically second-class subjects who exist at the whim of the ruler as well as the mob, if you look at history and how it has manifested itself. So that's the conditions of Omar, but it really, while many people talk about that document, and it has played a very important role in the codification of what we call now dhimmitude, which comes from the Arabic word dhimma, basically this idea that Christians and Jews who live under Islam are second-class citizens. It actually goes back to the Quran as well. Maybe many people forget this. So Quran 9:29, Surah Al-Tawbah, basically calls on Muslims to fight in perpetuity the people of the book, Christians and Jews, until you subjugate them. And in Arabic, وَهُمْ صَغَرُونَ means you humiliate them, you keep them suppressed, you keep them put down. So it's not just that you beat them, they need to know their place, essentially. And this is what so many Islamic jurists have, in their exegesis, have explained that verse, which very much complements the conditions of Omar that we've talked about. So throughout all of Egyptian history, as well as many other Middle Eastern countries that were conquered by Muslims, these laws were not just theoretical, they did manifest themselves habitually and regularly. And now, so you fast forward to today, and you look at the Egyptian constitution. I think Adel Gindi mentioned Article 2. It said, if you look at the constitution, and if you look at anything, actually, all the documents that come from Egypt and the government, they have a very Western-sounding quality to them. If you just read them at face value, everyone's equal. It doesn't say anything about religion, really. But then it says, Article 2 says, the principal source of all legislation is Sharia. And that essentially abrogates everything. Because now all that great talk that you read has to be defined and understood and qualified through Sharia. And Sharia is inherently, fundamentally discriminatory towards the non-Muslim. Okay, the dhimmi, as already discussed. It's in the Quran, it's in all the writings of the ulama. The modern notion that we have today of what a citizen is, something that transcends race and gender and religion, is completely absent in the Islamic world. Another way I've found that's helpful, rather than getting into the intricacies of Islamic law and what is and what non-Muslims are obligated to do and are not obligated to do, I found that in many ways the best way to understand it is the idea of tribalism. So before Islam came into the scene, Arabia was a tribal nation. So many other nations were tribal. And the whole idea of tribalism, irrespective of religion, is us versus you. My tribe versus your tribe. My tribe, we treat each other decently. You're out of the tribe, you're free game. You can be killed, you can be enslaved, plundered. That's how tribal mentalities work. In many ways, if you really look at the codification of Islam and the concept of Muslims vis-a-vis non-Muslims, it's very tribalistic. It's really essentially tribalism deified, which makes it worse because now God is enforcing tribalism. So if you look at the very various concepts in Islam, in Arabic, al-wala' wal-bara', okay, loyalty and enmity. Muslims must be loyal and helpful to Muslims no matter what, and they must have hatred for non-Muslims. This is all, of course, tribalistic thinking. So how can you have tribalism and the concept of citizenship? Obviously they're clashing, and for the various reasons I mentioned. And I'll just give you some very quick, just modern day examples that happened recently to show you how, the discrimination works. You probably are familiar with I think her name is Suat Thobet, who's probably 80 years old now, Coptic grandmother. So her son was accused of apparently dating a Muslim woman, which is forbidden in Islam. And Islam also says, as part of the conditions of Omar, that we, Christians and Jews who accept this pact, if one of us transgresses, we're all guilty. So collective punishment, past and present, has very much been present in Islamic nations when non-Muslims are being punished. At any rate, her son was accused of dating or whatever the case may be, and I heard it's also a false accusation. So they descended on the village, Muslims, they ransacked it. They took his mother out, who was at the time late 70s, stripped her naked, paraded her in the streets, spitting at her, slapping her, screaming Allahu Akbar, the whole 9 yards. And there's videos of the people who did this, and people know who did this, and there's sheikhs and clerics who are behind this. And the woman actually has tried to pursue justice. And she's gone to various appeals and courts, and finally it's been not only turned down, but now she's in trouble. Because she's considered harassing the people who did this to her. She's the one who's had to leave the village, not the people who abused her. So that again gives you an idea of how this sort of thing works. On paper, the Egyptian constitution and laws would not agree with this, but in reality, all the people involved know well, she had it coming to her because of what her son did. And also, a Christian's life is not equal to a Muslim. A Christian's word is not equal to a Muslim. So they go through all these machinations, and in the end, the culprits are exonerated, and now the victim is the one being punished. And you also probably heard of baby Shenouda, and this again goes to the idea of Islamic law and how Islamic law trumps humanity. So a newborn baby was found in a Coptic church, long story short, entrusted to a barren couple who were very happy. They took him, they baptized him, named him Shenouda. And once the state got wind of this, they actually took the child and put him in an orphanage on the idea that Islam teaches, which is that every human being is actually born a prototypical Muslim, and it's only later that they become whatever their parents mold them. But since this child's family cannot be identified, we have to assume he's a Muslim, born Muslim, and therefore you cannot give him to infidels. So it's better to throw him in an overcrowded orphanage. Okay, so yeah, and it's after 5 years too, after they had an actual relationship as parents and children. So these are the ideas that one has to keep in mind of what's really going on. And we also heard about the churches, 11 churches in 1 month that burned. And another one recently burned also, an ancient church. And we always hear these stories about, well, it's some faulty electric wiring. But as indicated earlier, even if that's the case, it just shows you how bad churches are treated. And in fact, I've read reports that the churches that do exist, because they're not allowed to repair or enlarge or augment, they are hazards. They're fire hazards. They're crowded. And that's why this sort of thing constantly happens. But that goes back to this inherent discrimination and discriminatory attitude for the non-Muslims. And at any rate, one can go on, but I'd rather give the time now to our panelists. And who I will introduce. Do you have a preference who goes first? Okay, it's you, Robert. Okay. First, Robert. Robert Destro is a professor of law at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law in Washington, D.C. since 1982. He's also a senior fellow at the university's Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies. His government service includes the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He was a commissioner between 83 and 89. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor. This was between 2019 and 2021. And Special Representative for Tibetan issues in 2020 to 21. And there's much more that can be said, but without further ado, Robert A. Destro.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. And is it on now? Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. It's great to be back. I mean, the last time, a little closer. Okay. It's great to be back. It's great to be with everybody again. And I have to say that in the absence, the time I spent inside the State Department and was very informative. I mean, it's one of those things that when you say, well, how does that change your view? Well, you know, during for at least 20 years, I spent a lot of time working on what we call Abrahamic dialogue. You know, kind of deeply involved in very searching conversations with Islamic scholars, primarily in Iran, but also in other places. And looking at that conversation that I had, and then looking at the way in which the State Department does business, gives you a slightly different perspective. And when, as I was privileged to be, sitting behind a sign that not just didn't have my name on it, it said United States. You know, that gives you a completely different perspective. I mean, because I remember sitting at the UN one day looking up and seeing that. I was like, whoa, how did I get here? You know, who came in? You know, but as I listened to the conversation, I took some time over the last few days, kind of immerse myself in the conversations, a lot of the literature about dhimmis, about dhimmitude. I also took some time to immerse myself in the language of the Egyptian Constitution, and and also in some recent work done by an Australian colleague that talks about the implications of the covenants of the Prophet Muhammad with the Christians of Najran. And so as I was thinking about what to say this morning, I think we are in a situation in which there's no question that the Coptic Christians are in the minority. So that just is. There's no question that the Islamic mindset is that you're dhimmis, and that simply is. And I was very interested when I read about the case of baby Shenouda. A very, very interesting set of circumstances. And it got me to thinking that rather than approaching this as a kind of human rights problem, we need to approach it as a bilateral diplomatic problem. And what that means in kind of layperson's terms is that, as I always would tell my staff, as well as the people on the other side, is what's your wish list? We need a specific wish list of things we need fixed. And then the question is, how do we go about negotiating for them? Because that is, as a matter of fact, is the way in which you have to deal with, among other things, intertribal problems. I mean, this is what we're really talking about is a clash of two completely different worldviews. I mean, the Judeo-Christian notion of civil rights presupposes the sovereignty of God. So too does Islam. So the question is, how do we get Muslims who think like Muslims to take seriously discussions within Islam about the rights of people who are non-Muslim? Okay, now, the biggest problem is that most of the time, and I saw this from a diplomatic perspective, dealing in countries like Nigeria, but you also see it in big issues like Russia and China. And that is, the other side is Russian, and they think like Russians. And the other side is Chinese, and they think like Chinese. So the question is, how do you frame your arguments so they hear you, right? And when Congressman Hill said, and they rolled their eyes, that is exactly the kind of a response that a diplomat cannot afford to get. Why? Because it's like, you Americans, right? So let me put it in a slightly different context for a minute. I'm going to talk about the Chinese for a minute. Now, as you all know, the Chinese are always stealing intellectual property. Now, from the Chinese perspective, is it even stealing? They don't even believe in private property. So the idea that we should be upset with them, of course we should be upset. The question is, not how do we get them to stop it, because they don't even think they're stealing. The question is, how do we protect ourselves? How do we negotiate a framework in which our interests are protected, assuming that they don't think we have any? That is the situation in which the Coptic Christian finds itself in Egypt. These people do not think that you have any rights, notwithstanding that nice piece of paper we call the Egyptian Constitution. The concept of citizenship is about connection in a community. Well, in the Islamic mindset, the community is the ummah, is the believers, right? You're not in it. In fact, your status in that community is one of negotiation. That's what the covenants are about. That basically you pay the jizya, you pay the tax, and we then, in response, will protect you. Okay, but you're not part of the us, you're a part of the them. Now, the fact of the matter is, that's just the way it is. And it's one of the reasons why really well-informed diplomats who represent the United States do a lot of studying about what makes the other side tick. What are the kinds of things they will respond to? Now, the case of baby Shenouda, I think, is a good example of not, quote, success, because it was negotiation in a specific case. So it doesn't stand for a general principle. What it stands for is an approach that succeeded. So the question becomes, at least from my perspective, and I have a bunch of cases I could give you examples of, where I think that we are forgetting, and I went and I checked last night on the website of the Diocese of the Coptic Church for the Southern United States, and I was looking for some commentary, particular commentary on the Acts of the Apostles. and in particular Acts 2, where it is said, how is it that each of us hears them in our own language, right? That, if we're going to talk about religion, let's talk about the starting point of our religion. The Christian faith, depends on the Holy Spirit speaking to all of us and to give us the messages that we would need in order to reach people who don't think like we do, right? And so the answer to some of these questions is to convince the Muslim scholars who advise the Egyptian government with respect to specific policies that what they're doing is not antisocial, but what they're doing is un-Islamic, right? That is an avenue. You're not going to win on a lot of them, but you can make progress, because if it is tribal, and I firmly believe that it is, and much of our own domestic politics, unfortunately, has become tribal, but if it's tribal, then you have to speak in the dialect of the other person. And doing that, what we need then is a very specific diplomatic wish list. Give me 10 things, which are the ones that are the most important, and then let's put together a team of people who know how to speak Islamic scholarship and then talk to them about it. Okay, Paul.
Okay. I'll introduce you. Thank you. I'd like to introduce now a very short of a long biography of Paul Marshal. He is Wilson Professor of Religious Freedom at Baylor University and Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and the Religious Freedom Institute, both in Washington, D.C. here. He has authored or edited over 20 books on religion and politics, including Persecuted, published in 2013, Silenced, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Choke Freedom Worldwide, 2011, Blind Spot, When Journalists Don't Get Religion, 2009, and I read that, by the way, very good. Religious Freedom in the World, 2008. His work has been translated in, I'm looking at a very long list, so I'll just start with A, Albania, and almost Z, Ukrainian, Paul Marshal.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I prefer to stand when I giving a talk. I'm a little more energetic and less likely to fall asleep when I'm speaking. In terms of the overall theme of how religion usurps citizenship rights in Egypt, I will cover particular things to do with the Copts. But much of this has already been covered and covered very well. So I'll make some comments on the Copts, but also deal with religious categories in Egypt generally, and consider three other minorities: the Shia, the Baha'i, and atheists. When referring to citizenship rights, citizenship, I mean basically that citizenship means that each person, or each adult person, has equal civil and political rights. Of course, the Egyptian constitution acknowledges this, but also has been noted, it also says the principles of Islamic Sharia are the principal source of legislation. Constitution also states that freedom of belief is absolute. The freedom of practicing religious rituals and establishing worship places for the followers of divine religions is a right regulated by law. The divine religions, of course, in this context are Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which means the freedom of religion does not extend to people who are not in those categories. The Constitution also states citizens are equal before the law, and prohibits discrimination on the basis of religion. Indeed, Article 161 of the Penal Code sets forth punishment of possible jail time and fines of many tens of thousands of pounds for someone who takes an action with the intent to discriminate on a number of bases, including religion and creed. But then remember the qualification: religion is restricted to those three categories, and it's in fact narrower. What patterns of discrimination and differences between citizens, even amongst the Abrahamic religions? Well, one could go on at length, but just some illustrations. General taxes pay for mosques, but not for churches. Probably about £4 billion a year go as subsidies to the Ministry of Islamic Endowments. General taxes pay for Islamic universities and schools, but not Christian ones. The Al-Azhar system is not just the Al-Azhar University, but has a range of educational institutions which include probably almost 3 million students and children. Construction of churches is still subject to additional regulations, which mosques are not subject to, and in any case will need the permission of the security services. As mentioned before, in matters of inheritance, Christians may be subject to Sharia law, as the case of baby Shenouda shows that adoption, while this is not in Egyptian statute, adoption is not allowed. And of course, there is widespread discrimination both privately and in government functions. Just two more. Muslim men may marry Christian women, but not vice versa. Or if a parent becomes a Muslim, then their children of minor age, and sometimes beyond that, are automatically remade as Muslims. So these are just some examples of differential rights in the country based on religion, which undercuts the notion of equal citizenship. Some other groups. Shiism is not recognized as a religion in Egypt. It is de facto, not stated in any law, it is de facto illegal and repressed. Shiites may not build mosques or other places of worship or engage in public worship. The actual propagation of Shiite views is itself treated as blasphemous. So a Shia who voices their religious beliefs or prays in public in a Shia manner or owns books promoting Shia thought may be charged with blasphemy or specifically Article 98F, insulting a heavenly religion. In 2003, the state-funded Islamic Research Center of Al-Azhar issued a fatwa I missed a page, sorry. So just to give one final example for Shia, in 2019, a criminal court in Cairo charged Ala Obeid, a convert to Shia Islam, was convicted of receiving foreign funding and establishing a website and printing books promoting the Shia faith. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. If we take the situations of Baha'is are denied legal recognition, and their institutions and community activities are forbidden. All Baha'i community properties, including cemeteries, were seized by the government under President Nasser. They can be denied because of problems with registration and identity cards. They can be denied access to government services, including schooling and health services, vilified by leading government figures and by senior Muslim leaders and in the media. Their marriages are not recognized, so their children can be denied birth certificates, which leads to the other problem of education, marriage, and many other things. They're also subject to periodic crackdowns by the security forces. In 2003, the Islamic Research Center of Al-Azhar, state-funded, issued a fatwa declaring Baha'is apostates and urging the state to annihilate the community. Or Ahmed Omar Hashim in 2019, chairing the Parliamentary Joint Commission on Defense and a previous head of Al-Azhar, claimed that Baha'is pose a greater threat to national security than extremists and terrorists because they are a product of Zionism. Background for that you probably know. The Baha'i Center began in Iran, but within the Ottoman Empire, they moved to Haifa on the Mediterranean. And later on, the country of Israel appeared there. So the Baha'i Center is in Israel, though it was there long before it was Israeli. Hence, they are castigated as Zionists. And as Frank Wolf mentioned, you can't list Baha'i on an ID card, so they are the dash religion, the little dash in the ID card. I'll just close one example on this. Mr. Musa described the difficulty he faced with military service. He was unable to complete military service since, as a Baha'i, he had no national ID. But because his father was a Baha'i, and that meant in the civil registry, he could not prove his son was an only son. And as you know, in Egypt, one grounds of exemption from military service is if you're the only son. But that could not be proved. So he was denied military service and forbidden to be exempt from military service. These are some of the corundum. His only consolation would be to go to prison for not actually doing the military service the state refused to let him do. So these are some of the complexities that you start to get here. Finally, comment on atheists. Again, atheism is not per se criminalized by Egyptian law, but again, if you're drawing on Sharia as a principal source of law, that would forbid atheism. And again, Article 98F of the Penal Code against insulting a heavenly religion is used against those. And atheists are sort of aggressively sometimes hunted and persecuted. In 2020, atheist blogger Anas Hussein was charged and convicted with defaming religion by maintaining a Facebook page for Egyptian atheists, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. So I've covered a range here, but to make the general point that in these cases with Copts, there's a much larger minority in Egypt, but with all of these minorities, that is, anybody who's not a Sunni Muslim, is subject to denial of citizenship rights based on their religion, which undercuts this. So one final note, I wrote my first book in Egypt almost exactly 25 years ago, called Egypt's Endangered Christians. And there's been ups and downs, things loosening on the regularization of churches front. But basically, I would say I could write that book with added illustrations, but it would be, sadly, it would be the same book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. If there are any questions that are supposed to be brought up to me, this would be the time, but I'll start off with a question observation specifically to you, Robert, but also Paul, if you'd like to opine. And I agree with your explanation of the different paradigms of thought of different peoples and how you have to actually try to articulate your position through their own to make it intelligible, and which made me think of something else that we often hear as what we need to do, and I think Frank Wolf emphasized it earlier today, which is that $1 billion. Money and power seem to transcend all cultures when it comes to, I mean, if you want to talk about a paradigm, I think that's understandable to them as well. So I think what in certain respects what you said actually sort of supports the idea that, that aid to Egypt, because that is something that everyone understands cross-culturally, power and money is something that could be intelligible. I don't know if either of you would like to comment on that.
Well, thanks. That's a great question. I'd like to recommend to everybody, just as some background reading, if you have time. There's a book that came out in January of 2022 by a young historian at Cornell called The Economic Weapon. And it's a kind of a magisterial history of sanctions. And I found it utterly fascinating because he looked at the question of both what you and I would recognize as negative sanctions, which is basically taking the money away, or excluding somebody from SWIFT, or any of the it's like an embargo, basically. But the other side is the part that you're talking about, which is what he calls the positive sanction. And unfortunately, he doesn't develop it much in the book. It's something that I've kind of want to do myself, which is what basically a drug junkie would call the nickel bag, which is the public assistance side. And basically, we want you dependent on the money, and therefore you will do what we want on threat of withdrawing it. So, and that, so the question of the one conviction in which the person was convicted of taking money from a foreign source, it's not an accident that other countries are getting very, very touchy about money coming from the State Department, and it's not an accident, by the way, that I saw some of the biggest fights I saw while I was in the State Department were over whether or not I, as the Assistant Secretary, who I had to remind people that I was the one who signed the check, was entitled to know what we were spending our money on. Now, just as it happens, there's a huge fight going on between the House Foreign Affairs Committee and my old bureau. In fact, the IRF Bureau in state over grants they're giving with respect to atheism, actively supporting atheism in South Asia. Now the question becomes, what do these do? How do these grants actually effectuate our foreign policy? It really raises the question, well, what is our foreign policy? So with respect to, the question that was just asked, what's my view on using, because money is a language that everybody understands, so there's no doubt about what you mean. But the more important homework question I would want to know before I do that would be, well, what messages are we conveying in the money that we're already giving in Egypt? That you would find to be almost a blood-on-the-floor battle within the State Department getting answers to those questions. So I think it's something that's well worth looking at. I think following the money is absolutely essential, but figuring out what it's actually going to on the ground and whether or not it's taking us anywhere. I suspect, for example, that if you went in for a big grant for Coptic lawyers to engage in extended conversations and negotiations with Islamic scholars at Al-Azhar, you wouldn't get a dime. Okay, you wouldn't get a dime. You wouldn't even get a dime to translate every single fatwa that affects the Coptic community because, as Paul pointed out in his book, they don't get religion. IRF doesn't get religion. So that's my answer.
Any follow-up or concluding thoughts, Paul?
No, I think that was a great answer, so I would only look like a clown afterwards.
Okay. And that concludes this panel. Thank you.